The ASUS ROG Ally X is hands down one of the best Windows-based PCs that you can buy right now. And there are other options. There's the Steam Deck, as well as the original Ally if you want to go that route, or the Legion Go, or the MSI Claw if you want to go that route as well. But at the end of the day, the Ally X improved everything that I did not like about the original Ally. And I think that's the biggest thing, because it means that ASUS is actually listening to us. Now, my first experience with the Ally X was over at ASUS's headquarters in Taipei, Taiwan. I went there for Computex. They invited myself, as well as, well, less than a handful of other YouTubers, to go and talk to the design team, to the engineers, and to the reps, just to provide direct feedback to these people. Because at the end of the day, for me personally, this was great, but the Ally 2 can be even better than this, which is really, truly exciting for us PC gamers. Now, shortly after that experience, I was eagerly waiting for a production unit to finally arrive, but instead they sent a sample unit. And this was really what the impressions video was based on. So you can follow that somewhere up here and you can click it and, watch that if you want to. But when it came down to it, I couldn't show any benchmarks, which kind of sucks, because the experience that I was having with that sample unit was so much better than the original Ally. So I had to wait until I actually got a production unit. And if you've been following the channel, you know exactly where I'm going with this. But when I finally got that production unit, and I started running benchmarks on it, I was just disappointed. The numbers were less than what they should have been. And in some instances, they were worse than the original Ally, which kind of sucks, because at the end of the day, this should be an improvement, even if it's minimal. So I reached out to the reps and I said, hey guys, like this is weird. This isn't normal. Could you help me figure out what's going on? Because I didn't do anything aside from setting up Armory Crate, and I'm running the same exact settings that I would run on the sample unit, but the performance is far less. So they said, you know what, we're going to send you a second production unit. Don't worry about it. Just send us back the original production unit. That way we can figure out what's going on with it. Maybe it's an engineering issue, or maybe there's an error, whatever it may be. So here I am. I have two production units that are right here, both of which do not have that yellow sticker that says that it's a sample unit. So I went ahead and, started running benchmarks. I wanted to see whether or not that this was an actual issue. And it turns out that, yeah, there are some problems that are there in terms of what I saw with the first production unit and the second production unit. Also, after having this for a few months and just gaming on it on and off, there are some blemishes that popped up that I didn't think were a big deal at first, but the more that I gamed on it, the more I realized that, yeah, this is definitely something that requires mentioning, especially if you're considering getting an Ally X for yourself. Now, I still think that this is the best Windows-based handheld right now, especially when you're comparing it to some of the other things that are out there, but there are some things to take into account if you are considering buying it for yourself. Now, when you're looking at the spec sheet, there are two main differences that glare out at you. First and foremost, the amount of RAM that you have, as well as the clock speed for that RAM, as well as the battery size. And I want to go ahead and mention right here, right now, that the amount of battery that you get does not equate to the amount of battery life that you're going to get, especially depending on the games that you're going to be playing. And I think that's really something that bears mentioning, especially when you're looking at the spec sheet, because that spec sheet, yeah, it's there, it looks nice, but it's not going to be exactly what you're going to experience on the tail end of things in a real world experience. So there's a couple of things that I've noticed in the few months that I've had the ROG Ally X. First and foremost, there is an actually somewhat functional sleep function when it comes to this. It's not going to work for every game. Some games it just works as it should, and there are some games where things don't work. And this also depends on the TDP that you're using. I've noticed that in some instances, if you're running a low TDP like silent, or even some cases in performance mode, if it's a heavier title, it just won't work at all. And if it does work, the moment that you turn on your unit again, it'll be super choppy for like the first 5-10 seconds, and then it'll get back into the game. Now, if you're running something lightweight like an indie title, or just something that doesn't really require that much juice, it'll work just fine. You don't have to worry about it. So sleep function, like a sleep function, kind of works. Not really 100% like the Steam Deck, but it is very similar. Obviously, you can install Bazzite OS onto the Ally X if you want to, or you can just, use Windows. So it really just depends on what it is that you want to do. But for me, seeing this, if you don't want to, mess with Bazzite or installing Bazzite on here, and you just want to use Windows as is, it kind of works, kind of, sort of, The battery life, guys, look at me. The battery life is fantastic on the ROG Ally X. This is something that I took with me pretty much I've been flying around for work and doing all sorts of things. I flew over the summer when I was coming back to the United States, and I was blown away that this lasted almost the entirety of my trip. I played a little bit of Elden Ring just to kind of, make some progression in Shadow of the Erdtree, which was what I was playing at the time. And then once I noticed that my battery was around like 50-ish%, I was like, you know what, I'll just play some Dave the Diver or maybe some Dead Cells, just something that isn't super heavy on the console, set a custom TDP, and I think it was around like 6-7 hours out of it. And this is the great thing about the battery on this handheld, is that if you're playing games like, for instance, Castlevania Dominus collection, you can play for hours on end and just keep on playing without having to worry about anything. So when it comes to battery life, this is the go-to. You do not have any sort of battery anxiety or battery FOMO at all with the ROG Ally X. This is just, it's awesome. I absolutely love it. I cannot recommend it enough. When it comes to battery life, this is the go-to. I do know that there are some of you that play exclusively on Windows, and by that I mean that you don't mess with Steam OS, you don't have a Steam Deck, you don't want to mess with Linux or Proton or anything like that, and you prefer Windows because of its compatibility. Now, me personally, I don't play any games that require Windows in order to run because of compatibility issues, so a lot of the games that I could play on the ROG Ally X, I could play on the Steam Deck without any issues at all. But I do know that there are a select few games that require Windows in order to run effectively because of anti-cheat software or whatever it may be. And I want you to know that those games run on the Ally X without any issues at all, without any hitches, because this is a Windows-based device. So in terms of compatibility, you don't have to worry about it. It just runs. Now, when it comes to ergonomics, things are okay. They're better than they were with the original Ally, which is something that I mentioned, and they're good enough to be passable for a long gaming session if you want to. And I think that's something that bears mentioning, because when it comes to gaming sessions, how many hours are you planning on gaming on this handheld? Now, obviously, if you're flying, wherever it may be, like I was using the Ally X for, a long flight. My flight, I think, was like 12 or 13 hours. Then in that instance, yeah, it makes sense to have a handheld that has a long battery life in that instance. But for most gaming sessions, you're gonna have, like 1, maybe 2 gaming hours, and after that, you're just gonna move on. But when it comes down to ergonomics, I didn't feel any sort of fatigue, any sort of discomfort. Things they were fine. And that increase in weight, although minute, it really didn't make that much of an impact, especially when you compare it to the original ROG Ally. Now, this isn't as heavy as the Legion Go, and it's not as light as the Steam Deck, but at the end of the day, it's a nice in-between, and it does a pretty good job in terms of having those ergonomics there, the button placement, as well as, changing the macro keys that are on the back of this handheld. It really just depends on what it is that you want. Now, me personally, I've been kind of just holding it like this, and that's just the way that it is. I know some people, they prefer to do one of these, but for me, at the end of the day, it feels comfortable to just have those pinkies that are not really for support, but just kind of have that as like a claw grip kind of. I don't know, but ergonomically, it's fine. It does the job. It does it better than the original Ally. When it comes to thermals, it's a bit of a touchy subject simply because of how it was on the original ROG Ally. Now, this is my Ally that I've had for quite some time. I went in and I bought this with my own money. The SD card slot is right over here. And with this, it's right next to the thermal vent, so it would get really hot. Now, this is the mod case from JSO, which I think is pretty awesome because it has a little kickstand that you can just go ahead and kind of pull out. If you want to attach a controller and just kind of game on there, you can. And it kind of protects the front, which is nice too. But that's for the original Ally. When it comes to the Ally X, the placement of the SD card is right in that same spot, which kind of, made me a little bit nervous the first time that I got the sample unit. But I've had 3 Ally X's. None of them have had issues in terms of their SD card reader and the operation. So I would download, upload different files. I would go ahead and install games onto the SD card and run them off of the SD card, and things just run. They work. I haven't had any issues at all. Based off of looking online, there haven't been any other YouTubers that have had issues. Like I mentioned earlier, the little fans that are inside, they went ahead and kind of, improve them. They're smaller, but they have more fins, which means that there's more air circulating, and there's a spot, a little vent right over here that essentially goes and is the air coming out that's in between the motherboard that's over here and the screen, which is really nice because that means that that screen that's there, it's not going to be as hot as it was on the original Ally when playing games, which I personally didn't run into too many problems with that, but my wife, when she was playing games on the original Ally, she would always complain about it, especially when she was playing Palia. But for me, I didn't have any issues because I didn't have to touch anything, but I do know that it does get hot on the Ally. So the Ally X being cooler in that sense is also better as well. One of the biggest things that I didn't like about the original ROG Ally was the fact that there was this XG mobile port that was at the top, which was for XG mobile eGPUs that only ASUS sold, which kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Now, I don't have an eGPU of any kind, whether it's XG mobile or a regular one, so I couldn't test it to see if it would work on any other eGPUs. As far as I know, they don't work on the ROG Ally, but I'm not a fan of a tech company specifically, creating a unique port that only works with unique hardware that only they sell. It seems really greedy, and I understand that it's kind of like pushing the medium forward, but at the end of the day, when it's not compatible with anything else out on the market, it just leaves a bad taste in my mouth. Now, with the ROG Ally X, they've changed that to where there's 2 USB ports at the top, which means that, you know, you have compatibility. You're able to use that with more eGPUs and not just the XG mobile port that's there. I think the only person that I know that actually bought an XG mobile eGPU is Russ from Retro Game Core, and like, that's it. I don't know anyone else that actually bought that stuff. So it's nice to, you know, have that functionality and that flexibility with the Ally X. I do wish that, you know, one of the ports was on the bottom, kind of how it is on the Legion Go. This is just a small gripe, just because I feel like those inputs, the actual USB input slots would eventually like go bad over time, just because of the weight and the pressure of the wires kind of just hanging on like the side versus it being on the bottom and directly connected and letting gravity do the work, you know, and sort of in terms of handling the wire and the weight. But that's just me. Again, I don't have an eGPU, so I couldn't really like test out the functionality of both USB ports, but the one time that I did actually utilize it, and I've been utilizing it ever since, is using it with Features Pro XR glasses, which I did a video review on. You can go ahead and check that up over here if you want to go and see how that works. But at the end of the day, like, it was awesome having that 30-watt TDP and kind of having that fully fledged, you know, visual experience on those XR glasses, you know, without any sort of interference or anything like that. Kind of, you know, it's nice to have that. It's a nice to have. So I do know why the ports are at the top and there isn't any on the bottom, and that's just because of the fact that the battery just takes up everything that's here on the bottom. They pretty much took the battery, put it all here, and it's all over here on the bottom, which is, you know, kind of leaves things cramped when it comes to the actual handheld itself. But at the end of the day, like, their engineers, I hope that they can figure something out that would work for that. This is just something that I noticed after using it for a long time, and, you know, it's nice to have. Those are all things that I noticed, positive aspects that I've noticed while using the Ally X. These are things that I may have noticed during the impressions and review video, but they just became much more of a stronger positive. I had stronger feelings about this handheld the longer that I went on playing games on the Ally X. Now, that being said and done, there are also negatives that became much more apparent the longer that I played games on the Ally X. First and foremost, Windows OS is, well, Windows OS. You get the pros, but you also get the cons. And the cons are something that takes a long time to boot up and get into a game, as well as things that just, there's a lot of background processes that are going to be happening while you're gaming on this handheld. Now, for example, to boot up and get into a game, you have to boot up the OS, log in, then you have to wait for Armory Crate to boot up and become your front end. After that, you pick your game, and depending on whatever launcher it is, you have to wait for that launcher to eventually boot up, and then you can finally get into the game. Now, most of this stuff does happen in the background or relatively quickly, but it's still an arduous process, especially when you compare it to something like SteamOS on the Steam Deck. Now, as we all know, the hardware between the Steam Deck and the ROG Ally X are pretty much night and day in a lot of fronts. I mean, you're going to be getting a nice performance boost on the Ally X, so if you want that ease of use with SteamOS on the Ally X, you could always install Bazzite OS, or you can just wait for Valve to release their SteamOS branch that would go on the Ally X. So there's a couple of options that that are there depending on what it is that you want to go ahead and do. But as of right now, if you don't want to mess with Bazzite OS and you don't want to mess with the hardware that you need in order to actually do this, then you're kind of stuck with Windows. And that's just all that you're going to have to deal with, unfortunately, until Valve finally releases their SteamOS branch for the Ally X. Until then, we're going to have to continuously deal with Windows OS or install Bazzite OS, whatever it is that you want. But there are other things that Windows kind of gets in the way of whenever you want to just game on here. For instance, the other night I was sitting there gaming and I wanted to stream games from my Xbox over the cloud onto my handheld. And when I finally got everything set up on my ROG Ally X, I realized that none of the controller inputs worked. And the only way that I've been able to figure out how to get this to work is literally by restarting the entire handheld. Not the app, but the entire handheld in order for things to work. I do not know if this is something that's tied to Armory Crate. I don't know if this is something that's tied to the Xbox app. If you have a solution, let me know in the comments below, because I'd love to find out how to actually fix this. But the only way that I've been able to fix this is by restarting this handheld. And that sucks, because let's say you want to go into a game. You're sitting there, you go through the entire boot up process, you're playing a couple of games, and you want to go into Xbox to stream games. You're not going to be able to. You're going to have to restart everything all over again. And yeah, a couple of times it's whatever, but every single time that you want to go ahead and play a game, it kind of just becomes annoying overall. And this is definitely something that I want to mention in this video, because it's definitely worth mentioning. On top of that, there are instances where OneDrive will pop in and it'll just completely destroy whatever it is that you're doing. And when I say that, it's not closing down the app or anything like that, but it'll cut off your controller input because of that notification that pops up on the bottom right hand corner. It's not a big deal, but if you're in the middle of a boss fight, or if you're in the middle of doing something within the game or the app, it definitely gets in the way of you actually continuing to do whatever it is that you're doing. Obviously, these are things that you can turn off in terms of notifications while you're gaming, but again, this is, it's just Windows jank, and it bears mentioning. But we all know what you guys are here for. You want to see the benchmark numbers. And this is kind of a unique situation, because I have two ROG Ally X units, and I know one of them is a dud outright, just because there are some instances where it performs worse than the ROG Ally, the original one. And this second unit is actually pretty good. It's almost on par, if not better, than the sample unit that I got in a lot of the same scenarios that I ran these benchmarks on. One thing that I have to let you know is that all of these benchmarks, all of these games that are here, are in the low preset, aside from a few of them. No Rest for the Wicked is set on performance mode, and the Cyberpunk 2077 numbers are all based on the Steam Deck preset that is built within the game. Aside from that, everything else is the same across the board, and you'll see some of the results that we have are a little bit interesting, especially when you're comparing two models that technically should be performing the same. Some of the results are, well, some of the differences that are there are kind of within the margin of error, but aside from that, some of them are kind of, well, just, you'll see. Before we get into all of these numbers, I did want to let you know that all of the games that were tested here were at a 1080p resolution. If you wanted to drop it down to 720, you will get a 10 to 15% increase in performance in terms of frames. There's also roughly 5 to 8% performance that I saw when I was testing 900p on some of these games. But overall, when it comes to 1080p, you'll see what the bare minimum will be in terms of frames. Again, you want more frames, go to a lower resolution overall. But that being said and done, looking at the 17-watt TDP between the first production unit and the second production unit, you're going to see roughly around 5 to 10 frame increase on the averages. But the biggest thing that I noticed was that the 1% lows were simply better overall, which meant that you're going to have a smoother experience on average. That means that you're not going to have too much stuttering and increasing and decreasing of frame rates as you're playing. Now, again, not everything is exactly as it should. There are some instances where things are just off, but when you're looking at, for instance, the 13-watt TDP, looking at Starfield, again, being above that 30 FPS mark, No Rest for the Wicked being, well, a green light mess and everything like that, but everything else just simply performed better overall. The interesting thing when we talk about the 17-watt TDP is the fact that Starfield performed worse with the second Ally unit than it did on the original. But on top of that, it is worth mentioning that that 24.41% low is looking amazing at a 17-watt TDP. And again, this is a recurring theme, that 1% low is there, and it's going to be an increased 1% low, which means that it's just a better overall experience. Now, looking at the 25-watt TDP, we're starting to see something that is closer to what we would see if we were to have a 30-watt TDP, or things were going to be plugged in. The difference between the two isn't as vast especially since you're kind of, you know, hitting the top of whatever goes into the game. Mostly what I would want to see from the next Ally or an Ally 2 is having more GPU instead of having more CPU. Like, the CPU is fine, but as far as like GPU, we need more GPU in there. We need something that is a little bit more powerful in order to play some of the games that we want to go ahead and play in a handheld. Again, looking at the themes that are there, there's higher frame rates on average, as well as higher 1% lows. And at the 30-watt TDP, this is really truly where we're going to see what the performance of this handheld really can do. You're getting around 60 frames in Starfield, 36.1 for No Rest for the Wicked, despite that 35.5 that you saw on the previous. Cyberpunk 2077, 52.4 frames per second, almost 60 frames per second. If you toggle on that AFMF, you're going to have a super smooth experience on Cyberpunk 2077, whether you're using AFMF 1.0 or 2.0. It's just, it's nice to have that experience overall. Same thing with Baldur's Gate, same thing with Elden Ring. You're just getting a better overall experience, and that 1% low that you're running into is just better overall. So you don't really have much to worry about when it comes to the overall performance and the experience that you're going to have while gaming on the ROG Ally X. I also wanted to run some synthetic tests to see if this actually performs well in terms of like production and really seeing what it can pull off. So in terms of the Cinebench scores, the multi-core is 12,740, and then the single core is 16,888. And for 3D Mark, I ran Time Spy, and that was 3446. So take that as you will, but in terms of performance overall, like, it does a really good job in terms of everything else that I saw. But I don't know, this isn't something that I would take with me as like my main go-to rig for working on, you know, production work on the go. I would rather take a laptop like an ASUS Zephyrus G16, for instance. I would rather take that over an ROG Ally X. It's not something that I could see myself doing. But if I have no other choice and, you know, I had to work on an ROG Ally X, I could do some work. I could knock some things out, slap on a Bluetooth keyboard, and just be able to make things happen. But overall, it's not something that I might see myself doing anytime in the future. So now that everything's said and done, I think the question arises, is the third unit that I got, is that, you know, handpicked, is it cherry picked by ASUS in order to make sure that I had really good numbers? Or is the second unit that they sent a dud, and the third one is supposed to be kind of like how every other Ally X is supposed to be? I think it's more of the latter. I think, you know, they just went ahead and sent me another one to call it a day, and they're expecting for me to send this second unit back. And the reason being is that I think that is because the sample unit, unbeknownst to them, performed beautifully. I thought it was awesome. I was having so much fun playing on that Ally X, and when I got that first production unit, the second one that came my way, I was a little bit disappointed, and I reached out to other YouTubers that I knew went with me to Taipei, Taiwan, and we were comparing numbers, and like their numbers were pretty much 1-to-1 between the sample unit and the first production unit that they got. I was just the unlucky one, and I guess I lost the silicon lottery. This second unit, or the third unit, excuse me, the second production unit that I got, the third unit, is actually really performing on par. So I don't know. I think that it was a silly mistake. You know, it was just me being unlucky. But this really feels like the way that the Ally X should be performing. So what do you guys think of the ROG Ally X? Is this something that you're going to be getting? Are you going to be waiting for a sale, or are you just going to skip it entirely and just wait for the Ally 2? Or are you in the Steam Deck camp, or the Legion Go camp, or the MSI Claw camp? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on things. And if you want to see what my original video on the ROG Ally X was, then click this video over here. And if you want to hear my thoughts on the Steam Deck versus everything else, then click this video over here. And until next time, guys, I will see you on the next one. Peace.